the Book of Enoch. In 364 CE, a council of bishops sat down with a list. On one side of that list were the texts that would tell humanity who it was, where it came from, and what it owed to God. On the other side were the texts that would disappear. When the Council of Laodicea finished its work, one book had been cut from history with surgical precision. Not because it was implausible, not because it was poorly written, because it was too specific. The Book of Enoch names names. It names a mountain. It names a curriculum. And it names the beings who delivered that curriculum to early humanity in detail so precise that it reads less like mythology and more like a deposition. The text describes 200 beings called the Watchers, angelic figures who descended to a specific location. Mount Hermon, in what is now the border region of modern Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. The mountain's name in Hebrew derives from the root cherem, meaning forbidden, or devoted to destruction. The Watchers took human wives, and then, in numbered sequence, their leaders each taught humanity a specific forbidden science. Azazel taught metallurgy and the crafting of weapons. Barachel taught astronomy. Kazdejah taught what the text calls the smiting of embryos. Semjaza led the group. Each leader is named. Each subject is assigned. This is not the grammar of myth. Myths don't need a roster. What makes this impossible to simply dismiss is where it survived. In 1947, Bedouin shepherds discovered a series of caves near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea at a site called Qumran. Inside Cave 4 alone, scholars eventually identified over 15,000 manuscript fragments representing approximately 200 distinct texts. Among them were fragments from at least 11 separate copies of the Book of Enoch written in Aramaic and dated by scholars to at least a century before the Christian era. The community that preserved these fragments also preserved Isaiah, Psalms, and Deuteronomy. They treated the Book of Enoch with the same reverence as the texts that would become canonical scripture. Scholar J.T. Mielek published the Aramaic Enoch fragments in his 1976 volume on the Books of Enoch, establishing their pre-Christian date beyond reasonable dispute. 11 copies, not a curiosity tucked in a corner. A central text of a serious scribal community. And yet the Council of Laodicea, in Canon 60 of 364 CE, explicitly excluded it from the biblical canon. It is one of the only exclusion decrees in early church history where the order itself survives in writing. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions on earth, never accepted that order. They have carried the Book of Enoch as canonical scripture for approximately 1,500 years. James Bruce brought 3 copies back to Europe from Abyssinia in 1773, and the Western scholarly world encountered it for the first time as though it were a discovery. It wasn't a discovery. It had simply been suppressed. The Book of Jubilees, also recovered at Qumran, independently corroborates the Watcher narrative in nearly identical structural terms. 2 separate ancient sources, same story, same mountain, same curriculum. Mainstream scholarship classifies Enoch as Jewish apocalyptic literature, a genre common between 300 BCE and 100 CE. The Watchers in this reading are a mythological metaphor for the corruption of civilization. The priestly classes intermarrying with common bloodlines, producing moral disorder. The exclusion from canon reflects the early church's reasonable effort to standardize doctrine and eliminate texts that complicated its emerging Christological narrative. That explanation is coherent, and it deserves to be heard. But here is what it doesn't explain. The text names Mount Hermon, a real, locatable mountain sitting today on the intersection of 3 modern national borders, as the specific landing site. Metaphors don't require GPS coordinates, and the naming of individual sciences, assigned to individual leaders, each with their own domain of forbidden knowledge, doesn't behave like allegory. Allegory generalizes. This text particularizes. Why did the only institution with the power to erase it choose to do so? And why did the scribes of Qumran, who preserved the books they believed were true, make 11 copies? From the oldest suppressed book in Western history, we turn to a book that has never been read at all, not because anyone destroyed it, but because no one alive today speaks its language. The Voynich manuscript. Picture a book that defeated the team that cracked the Enigma machine. Picture it sitting in a locked vault at Yale University, studied, photographed, digitized, and run through some of the most sophisticated computational analysis ever applied to a written text. Picture every codebreaker, linguist, and cryptographer who has touched it walking away with nothing. Now understand that this has been happening for over 600 years. The Voynich manuscript is 240 pages long. It is written in a flowing, consistent, unhesitating script using an alphabet of somewhere between 20 and 25 distinct characters. It is organized into what appear to be coherent chapters: botanical, astronomical, biological, pharmaceutical, and cosmological sections, each illustrated with images that are among the strangest in the history of recorded human art. The plants depicted match no known species on Earth. The naked female figures bathing in an elaborate interconnected plumbing system correspond to no medical tradition anyone has identified. One of the astronomical diagrams appears to show a spiral galaxy, a cosmological structure that Western science did not formally observe and document until Charles Messier's catalogue of 1771. The vellum is real. The University of Arizona carbon dated it in 2009, placing its creation between 1404 and 1438 with 95% confidence. So whatever this is, it was written on genuine 15th century material. The manuscript surfaced in the collection of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II of Prague around 1600 CE. Rudolf reportedly paid 600 gold ducats for it, the price of a small estate. The letter that came with it, written in 1666 by a scholar named Georg Berisch, stated plainly that the book had already baffled the greatest minds of his generation. It passed through the hands of Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher, one of the most brilliant polyglots of the 17th century, who failed to read a word of it. Wilfrid Voynich, the Polish antiquarian whose name it now carries, purchased it in 1912 from the Jesuit Villa Mondragone in Frascati, Italy, and brought it to public attention. In 2013, computational linguists Marcello Montemuro and Daniele Zanet published an analysis in the journal PLOS ONE confirming that the text follows Zipf's law, the statistical signature of real human language. It is not random. It is not noise. Its symbol distribution, its positional regularity, its internal structure all behave the way genuine written language behaves. Wojtek Ada's 2014 statistical study found that the text's entropy rate matches natural languages like Latin and Arabic, definitively ruling out simple substitution ciphers. In 2017, Greg Kondrak and Bradley Hauer at the University of Alberta ran the text through AI analysis and tentatively suggested Hebrew as a possible base language after vowel stripping. But translation attempts produced only partial and deeply ambiguous results. The NSA has looked at it. William Friedman, the cryptanalyst who broke Japanese military codes during the Second World War, spent years on the Voynich manuscript and reportedly concluded it represented an invented language. His notes were held from public access for decades. The mainstream explanation is a hoax, possibly constructed by Edward Kelly, a known forger who worked with the royal astrologer John Dee to extract money from the credulous Rudolph II. In this reading, the language-like patterns are sophisticated gibberish designed to appear meaningful. The plants are fantasy. The astronomy is decoration, a brilliant con. But hoax documents do not follow Zipf's law. That statistical regularity cannot be faked without a more sophisticated understanding of mathematical linguistics than existed in the 15th century. Friedman's team, the men who decoded an entire national military cipher, could not find the seam. No forger in documented history has successfully produced artificial text that passes computational language analysis at 240 pages of length. What if the Voynich manuscript is a technical codex written in a language that belongs to a tradition that was completely destroyed before it could leave any other written record? What if the spiral galaxy appears in it because whoever wrote it was observing the sky with greater precision than we assume was possible? And what was on those pages that Rudolph II paid a small fortune to own? From a book no one can read, we travel to a book that one man supposedly wrote in a single night. And the evidence suggests that timeline is physically impossible, yet the alternative is even harder to explain. The Codex Gigas. The story goes like this. A monk in a Benedictine monastery in Bohemia in the early 13th century breaks his vows. His punishment is to be walled up alive. In desperation, he makes a deal. He will write a book containing all of human knowledge before dawn. By midnight, he realizes he cannot do it alone. He prays to a different power, and by the time the sun rises, the book is complete. On page 290, there is a portrait. It is approximately 50 centimeters tall, rendered in full color, and it is a picture of the devil. It is the only dedicated full-page devil portrait in all of medieval manuscript tradition. The book weighs 74.8 kilograms. It stands 92 centimeters tall. It requires 2 people to lift it. It still exists. It is in the National Library of Sweden in Stockholm. The Codex Gigas, which translates simply as the Giant Book, was created at the Benedictine monastery of Podlajice in what is now the Czech Republic, sometime between approximately 1204 and 1230 CE. Swedish forces seized it as war spoils in 1648 during the 30 Years' War and transported it to Stockholm, where it has remained ever since. The monastery of Podlajice was completely destroyed in 1421 during the Hussite Wars. No other records of the monastery survive. The codex is the only artifact that made it out. Paleographers, scholars who analyze historical handwriting, have examined every page of the codex and confirmed a single author throughout. The ink composition is consistent. The letter formation is identical from page 1 to page 310. There is no stylistic drift, no variation in pressure, no signs of aging in the hand. This is the detail that stops experts cold. A human being writing for 20 or 30 years accumulates microscopic changes in the way they form letters. It is neurologically inevitable, the same way your handwriting at 40 looks different from your handwriting at 20. The codex shows none of that. The hand on the first page is identical to the hand on the last. At a reasonable medieval scribal pace of 6 to 8 hours of writing per day, researchers calculating the physical labor involved have estimated the work would require between 20 and 30 years of continuous daily effort. The consistency of the result is impossible under those conditions, and yet the result is undeniable. The manuscript contains the complete Latin Vulgate Bible, the full works of Flavius Josephus, including his Antiquities of the Jews and Jewish War, Isidore of Seville's Etymology, the Chronicle of Bohemia by Cosmas of Prague, a complete medical text, a full calendar, and a collection of magical formulae and exorcism rites, the entire scope of 13th century human knowledge in one volume. The production of the vellum alone required approximately 160 animal hides. Someone slaughtered an entire herd for this book. And then there are the missing pages. Infrared analysis has revealed that a significant number of pages were removed from the codex at some point after its completion. Which pages they were, what they contained, and who removed them has never been determined. A book described as containing all of human knowledge is missing sections that someone decided should not survive. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. The single knight legend is medieval mythology, a way of explaining extraordinary human achievement in supernatural terms. A disciplined, long-lived monk dedicated his entire adult life to the project. The consistency of the hand reflects exceptional self-discipline, not the impossible. The devil portrait is unusual but theologically consistent with medieval Christian imagery. You depict evil to warn against it. But the consistency argument breaks down against what we know about human neurology. Stylistic drift is not a matter of discipline. It happens to every human writer, regardless of intention. And the missing pages are not explained by any mainstream account. Someone, before or after the manuscript left Bohemia, made a decision about what parts of the most complete book ever assembled should be allowed to continue existing. What was on those pages? Who removed them? And why, out of the entire tradition of medieval Christian manuscript art, is this the only book with a full-page portrait of the devil staring back at you from the center of its pages? From a book whose impossible consistency raises questions about what produced it, we turn to a book that kings paid fortunes to acquire, because what it described was the ability to control everything around you. The Picatrix. In 1256 CE, King Alfonso X of Castile, a monarch sophisticated enough to commission rigorous scientific translations of Arabic astronomy and mathematics, a man who corresponded with scholars across the Mediterranean world, ordered a secret Latin translation of an Arabic grimoire that had been circulating in handwritten copies among court astrologers for 2 centuries. He wanted it in a language his scholars could use. What his translators produced was 400 pages of material that the Catholic Church would eventually place on its index of forbidden books, and that Renaissance court magicians would treat as the most powerful technical manual in existence. The Arabic original, titled Gayat al-Hakim, or The Aim of the Sage, was compiled in Andalusia around 1000 CE. It is organized into 4 books and 93 chapters. This is not the structure of folklore. This is the structure of a technical curriculum. Book 1 establishes the mathematical and philosophical basis of astral influence. Book 2 describes the construction of what the text calls talismanic cities, urban centers designed with astrological alignment so that their architecture channels specific planetary forces into their populations. Book 3 contains psychoactive drug recipes in precise ratios, combining ingredients including henbane, opium, and hashish for the stated purpose of opening the mind to what the text calls stellar intelligences. Book 4 provides direct instructions for contacting beings described as existing outside normal human perception. The drug recipes have been analyzed by modern pharmacologists who have confirmed that the compound formulas would produce altered states of consciousness consistent with the experiences the text describes. Someone was not guessing at these ratios. Someone was testing them and recording results. The architectural theory is equally specific. Historian David Pingree at Brown University documented the Picatrix's talismanic city framework in his 1986 critical study, tracing how the text describes urban geometry as a tool for producing calculated psychological effects in populations. Researcher Liana de Girolami Cheney has traced apparent influence from these principles on specific Renaissance artistic programs, including the Palazzo Schifanoia frescoes in Ferrara from the 1470s. The idea that you could design a city to make its inhabitants feel and think in particular ways is not mysticism, it is urban psychology. And the Picatrix was describing it 800 years before modern researchers began formalizing the concept. What the text claims about itself is perhaps the most unsettling detail. It states explicitly that its knowledge derives from a civilization it calls the tradition of Hermes, equated with the Egyptian god Thoth, and that this knowledge predates the Arab, Greek, and Roman periods entirely. It claims to be a preservation, not an invention, a transmission from before. The mainstream classification is clear. The Picatrix is a sophisticated example of medieval Arabic natural magic, a tradition that blended Neoplatonic philosophy, astrology, and folk medicine into a coherent but ultimately non-scientific system. The drug recipes reflect real herbalism. The city theory reflects medieval astrological belief. The pre-flood origin claims are standard rhetorical authority-granting devices used throughout esoteric literature. Alfonso X was an intellectually curious patron operating in a culture where the boundary between natural philosophy and magic had not yet been drawn. But Alfonso X drew that boundary for everything else. His astronomical commissions, the Alphonsine tables, used by European navigators for centuries, were rigorous empirical science. He did not fund mysticism. He funded knowledge. And the drug recipes in the Picatrix don't read like the output of folk belief. They read like controlled experiments, dose specifications, observed effects, recorded outcomes. What if the Picatrix is an empirical record of consciousness research conducted over generations, wrapped in the only available language, astrological, because no other framework existed to describe what was being documented? What if the stellar intelligences were a repeatable, documented phenomenological experience produced by specific compounds, and the text's extraordinary detail reflects the records of researchers who were simply writing down what they found? And what exactly did they find? And who decided that knowledge needed to be forbidden? From a royal court in medieval Spain, we traveled to a cliff face in Upper Egypt, where in 1945, a farmer digging for fertilizer cracked open a jar that the most powerful religious institution in the Western world had spent 1,500 years trying to make sure no one would ever find. The Nag Hammadi Library. In 390 CE, Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, issued what is known as his 39th Festal Letter. In it, he listed the texts permitted to define Christian truth. Everything else, he ordered, was to be destroyed. That same year, or very close to it, someone in the Egyptian desert walked to the base of a cliff called Jabal al-Tarif near the town of Nag Hammadi, dug a hole, placed 13 leather-bound books in a sealed clay jar, covered it over, and walked away. They never came back. Whatever they knew was coming, they were right. The jar sat undisturbed in the sand for 1,555 years. In December of 1945, an Egyptian farmer named Mohammed Ali al-Saman struck it with his mattock while digging for fertilizer. He broke it open and found the books inside. He burned some of the pages as kindling before anyone understood what he had. The surviving 52 texts eventually made their way to the Coptic Museum in Cairo. A complete English scholarly edition, edited by James M. Robinson, was published in 1977. Carbon-14 testing and paleographic analysis date the physical manuscripts to approximately 350 to 400 CE, meaning they were made and buried within the window of Athanasius's destruction order. What came out of that jar was a cosmology that inverts Orthodox Christianity from its foundation. The central claim of the Nag Hammadi texts is not that Jesus didn't exist or that his teachings were false. It is something far more radical. The God of the Old Testament, the creator of the physical world, is not the supreme divine being. He is a lesser entity, a blind and arrogant craftsman the texts call the demiurge, named Yaldabaoth, who fashioned the material world as a kind of prison for sparks of divine consciousness trapped inside human bodies. The true source of divinity is unknowable, unreachable through any institutional church, accessible only through interior knowledge, the texts call gnosis. The path to liberation is not obedience, it is awakening. These texts were not written by outsiders attacking Christianity from beyond its walls. They were written by Christians, people who believed in Jesus, who used his name and his teachings, who described themselves as his followers, and who arrived at a radically different understanding of what he was trying to say. Princeton scholar Elaine Pagels established in her 1979 book, The Gnostic Gospels, that the Nag Hammadi texts represent suppressed early Christian traditions contemporaneous with the canonical Gospels, not later heretical deviations. The Gospel of Thomas, found in Codex II, contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus with no narrative of crucifixion, resurrection, or salvation through sacrifice, just teaching, raw and unadorned, in a form that structural scholars believe may predate Matthew and Luke. The Apocryphon of John describes the creation of the human body with physiological specificity absent from any canonical account. The Gospel of Philip refers to Mary Magdalene with a closeness of relationship that the canonical tradition excised entirely. Mainstream biblical scholarship acknowledges these texts as genuine early Christian writings, while arguing they represent minority positions that lost out in legitimate theological debate. The councils that excluded them were engaged in reasoned doctrinal deliberation, not a power grab. The Gnostic tradition was incompatible with the emerging consensus and was set aside accordingly. But Athanasius's letter didn't invite debate. It ordered destruction. And the monks of the Pachomian monastery near Nag Hammadi chose burial over burning, a choice that carried real consequences, real risk, real loss. People don't make that choice for texts they believe are theological footnotes. They make it for texts they believe are true. What if the church that survived into history was not the original Christianity, but its victor? The version that won a political and theological war and then spent 15 centuries erasing the evidence that the war had taken place. What would it mean if the oldest Christian documents describe a creator God who was not the supreme being, and if that claim was considered dangerous enough to burn? From a buried jar in Egypt, we climb north to the Judean desert, where another set of hidden texts named one by one the beings who supposedly set all of this in motion. The Book of Giants. In 1952, scholars excavating Cave 4 at Qumran on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea made a discovery that should have dominated headlines for a generation. Over 15,000 manuscript fragments came out of that cave, representing approximately 200 distinct texts. Among them were the remnants of a story that the canonical tradition had reduced to a single ambiguous verse in Genesis. The Book of Giants is not a metaphor, it is a chronicle. And it has a cast of characters. The text is an expansion of the Watcher narrative from the Book of Enoch, but it does something Enoch doesn't. It follows the Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers and human women, into their own lives, their own relationships, their own terror. Scholars identified fragments from at least 6 separate copies of the Book of Giants in Cave 4 alone, written in Aramaic, dated by linguist Joseph Milik in his 1976 study to at least a century before the Christian era. 6 copies in one cave. This was not a marginal document. This was a text the Qumran community reproduced and preserved. The giants are named: Mahaweh, Ohya, Hakya, and their father Shemihaza appear as individual characters with distinct voices. The narrative describes them experiencing prophetic nightmares, visions of their own destruction that they cannot interpret. They send a messenger named Mahaway to find Enoch, described as living among the angels, to ask him what the dreams mean. Enoch's reply, preserved in fragments, is unambiguous. Their end is coming. The text treats these figures not as symbols or allegories, but as specific historical individuals with fears, disputes, and a desperate need for answers. Read the fragments closely, and the texture is that of a historical record, not a myth. Then consider this. A completely separate manuscript tradition of the Book of Giants was discovered in Turfan in what is now Xinjiang in western China, among Manichaean texts dated to several centuries CE. German scholar W. B. Henning published his analysis of these fragments in 1943, identifying giant characters from Iranian mythology, Sam and Nariman, woven into the same narrative framework as the Qumran version. The story had traveled the entire length of the Silk Road. It had been absorbed into Persian mythology. A text found in the Judean desert in 1952 had a parallel version in Central Asia that had been circulating independently for centuries. Mainstream scholarship explains this as the natural diffusion of Jewish apocalyptic literature through trade routes and religious contact. The Manichaean faith, founded by Mani in 3rd century Persia, was known for synthesizing diverse religious traditions, and the Watcher and Giant narratives were available material. The Qumran community's multiple copies reflect their particular theological interests, not the text's historical validity. The giants are literary elaborations on a 6-word Genesis reference, nothing more. But literary elaborations do not generate 6 manuscript copies in a single library. They do not travel from Judea to China and get integrated into a completely separate religious tradition as a foundational text. That is not the footprint of creative fiction. That is the footprint of a document that multiple cultures, separated by thousands of kilometers, recognized as describing something real. The full Dead Sea Scrolls were not made publicly available for over 40 years after their discovery. Comprehensive scholarly access was only granted in 1991, following sustained public pressure and the intervention of the Huntington Library in California, which released photographs of the full collection over official objection. The delay has never been satisfactorily explained by the text's custodians. If the Book of Giants is mythology, why did 6 different scribes in one community make copies? Why did it travel to China? And what exactly are we to make of the canonical tradition reducing an entire population, named, characterized, and documented across multiple ancient sources, to a single verse in Genesis that reads, "There were giants in the earth in those days"? From the Judean desert, we move west and forward in time to an Arabic manuscript that claimed to preserve knowledge from before all of these stories began, and that the greatest mathematical mind of the modern era spent more time studying than he spent writing the laws of physics. The Emerald Tablet. Isaac Newton wrote the Principia Mathematica, the document that established the mathematical foundation of classical physics and described the laws governing every object in the universe, in approximately 18 months. He spent more time than that translating and annotating a text that was, at the point he encountered it, already at least 1,000 years old and of entirely unknown origin. He never published that translation. He kept it private, filed among papers that he apparently never intended anyone to see. In 1936, Newton's private papers were auctioned at Sotheby's in London as part of the Portsmouth collection. The economist John Maynard Keynes purchased a significant portion of them. When Keynes read what Newton had actually spent decades of his life studying alongside his physics, He delivered a lecture in 1942 that has been quietly extraordinary ever since. Newton, Keynes said, was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians. The manuscript containing Newton's Emerald Tablet translation and annotations, catalogued as MS 416, is held today in the Keynes collection at King's College, Cambridge. It is available to scholars. It has Newton's handwriting in the margins. He was not dabbling, he was working. The Emerald Tablet is 13 lines long. It first appears in written form in an Arabic text called the Sur al-Khaliqa, the Book of the Secret of Creation, which scholar Ursula Weiser has dated to no later than the 3rd century CE in its original form, making it at minimum 1700 years old. No physical Emerald Tablet has ever been found. No original material source has ever been identified. What exists are Arabic translations of translations, the oldest of which are already copies of something older. 17 different medieval Latin translations exist. 17 different scholars, spanning 600 years of European intellectual history, each attempting to extract something from 13 lines of text. The central claim of the tablet is compressed into a single statement. That which is above is like that which is below, and that which is below is like that which is above. This is not decorative mysticism. It is a structural claim about the physical world, that the behavior of large systems mirrors the behavior of small ones, that the same laws operate at every scale. This is precisely what Newton's law of universal gravitation demonstrates. The apple falling from a tree and the planet orbiting the sun obey the same equation. Scale invariance, the principle that physical law holds across scales, is one of the foundational assumptions of modern physics. Benoit Mandelbrot formalized it mathematically in his fractal geometry work beginning in 1975. The Emerald Tablet was making the claim 17 centuries earlier. Robert Boyle, credited as the father of modern chemistry, was also an active alchemist whose private papers, only fully catalogued in the 20th century, show sustained engagement with the tablet and the tradition it represents. The text's attributed author, Hermes Trismegistus, connects it to the Hermetic tradition, a synthesis of Greek, Egyptian, and Babylonian intellectual lineages that predates Greek philosophy as we understand it. Historians of science are clear. The Emerald Tablet is the foundational document of the alchemical tradition, a sophisticated but non-scientific system that blended chemistry, philosophy, and mysticism. Newton's engagement with it reflects the intellectual landscape of the 17th century, when natural philosophy and magic occupied adjacent territory. The as above so below principle is a philosophical metaphor that anticipated nothing. It described a worldview, but Newton didn't engage with it as metaphor. His annotations are interpretive and technical. He was trying to extract a procedure, and the specific principle the tablet describes is the one his own work proves. When the man who discovered the mathematical structure of the universe treats a 13-line ancient text as a technical document, the appropriate response is probably not to assume he was wasting his time. What did Newton find in those papers that he chose never to publish? And what was the original knowledge the tablet was encoding? And from which civilization exactly did it come? From an ancient text encoded in 13 lines, we turn to an ancient text that encoded something even larger, the structure of creation itself, and apparently the instructions for replicating it. The Sefer Yetzirah, the Talmud, is not a book of legends. It is a legal document, the most sober, rigorous, carefully argued body of jurisprudence in Jewish tradition, concerned with precedent, procedure, and the precise boundaries of permitted conduct. When it records that a rabbi created a man, it is doing so in the context of legal reasoning. It is citing a precedent, and it names the rabbi. Tractate Sanhedrin, Section 65b of the Babylonian Talmud records that Rava created a man and sent him to Rabbi Zeira, who spoke to the figure and received no answer, and then told it, "Return to your dust." It records that Rav Hanina and Rav Oshaya created a calf and ate it. These are named identifiable historical figures in a legal context. The text does not treat this as miraculous. It treats it as an expected application of advanced knowledge. The knowledge in question was the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, the oldest known Kabbalistic text attributed to the patriarch Abraham and composed, according to scholars, somewhere between 200 BCE and 600 CE. It is a short text, only a few thousand words, but its claims are total. It describes the mechanism by which God created the universe, encoding reality through 32 paths of wisdom, 10 sephirot, primordial qualities or numbers, and 22 Hebrew letters. The letters in this system are not symbols for sounds. They are the operating instructions of physical reality. Each corresponds to a specific element, a specific direction, a specific force. The text implies that if a human being masters the combinatorial logic of this system, they can do what God did, create life from matter. The Saadia Gaon, one of the most rigorous and respected Jewish philosophers of the medieval period, wrote a major commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah in 931 CE. He did not treat it as myth. He engaged with it as a work of systematic cosmology, a genuine ontological framework describing the structure of creation in terms that could be analyzed, argued over, and applied. The text's 22 letters produce what it calls 231 gates, pairwise combinations of the alphabet, specifically identified as the generative basis of all language and all creation. This is a combinatorial system, and Norbert Wiener, the founder of cybernetics, the science of control and communication in machines that became the theoretical foundation of computing, wrote explicitly in his 1950 book, The Human Use of Human Beings, that the golem tradition was the mythological precursor to the automaton. The man who invented the conceptual framework that made computers possible looked at the Sefer Yetzirah and recognized in it the logic of what he was doing. Rabbi Eliezer Rokeek of Worms, writing in the 12th century CE, left instructions for creating a golem using the Sefer Yetzirah's combinatorial principles that specify the use of virgin soil, particular sequences of letter pronunciation, and the inscription of the word emet, truth, on the creature's forehead. These are not vague spiritual gestures. They are technical specifications. Mainstream scholarship is precise about what this text is: a philosophical meditation on the nature of divine language, exploring how speech brings reality into being. The Talmudic golem stories are homiletic tales about the limits of human creativity, not literal accounts. The 22 letters and 10 sephirot constitute a linguistic cosmological metaphor. The Maharal of Prague's golem, the most famous version of the legend, associated with Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel in the 16th century, is folklore that accumulated around a historical figure whose gravestone still stands in the old Jewish cemetery in Prague. But the Talmud does not use homiletic tales in its legal sections, and Norbert Wiener was not given to mystical romanticism. He saw something structurally real in the tradition, a logic of creation through information that his own work was formalizing in mathematical terms 17 centuries later. What if creation through language code is not metaphor, but description? What if the rabbis who generated a calf from the Sefer Yetzirah's instructions were doing something closer to programming than to prayer? And if so, what does it mean that the same logic now runs in every computer on Earth, and that the text describing it was classified as forbidden knowledge? From the encoded language of creation, we travel to Hungary, where a book donated anonymously to a scientific institution speaks a language that nobody on Earth has been able to decode, and where the pictures it contains may tell a stranger story than any text. The Rohank Codex. In 1838, someone donated a handwritten book to the Hungarian Academy of Sciences in Budapest and left no name. The donation came through the estate of Count Gustav Battiani, whose library was auctioned after his death, and the book was listed simply as coming from the Rohank Castle, hence the name it carries today. No provenance before the Battiani estate has ever been established. No record of the book's creation, its journey, or its author has ever been found. What arrived at the Academy was 448 pages of handwritten text accompanied by 87 full-page illustrations written in a script that has more unique symbols than any known human writing system on Earth. Most alphabets use between 20 and 50 characters. The Rohank script uses between 87 and 200 unique symbols, depending on the analytical method applied, a range more consistent with syllabic or logographic writing than with alphabetic systems. Yet a 2018 computational analysis by Hungarian researchers Levente Zoltán Királyi and Gabor Tokaj found that the symbol distribution, positional regularity, and internal structure of the Rohank text are consistent with natural language rather than randomly generated or deliberately meaningless content. The script behaves like language. It just isn't any language anyone has identified. The 87 illustrations are, in their own way, more disturbing than the unreadable text. They show 36 battle scenes rendered in a consistent artistic style. They show religious ceremonies. They show a figure that appears to be Christ on a cross. They show ceremonies that resemble Hindu sun worship. They show a figure holding a crescent. All of this in a single manuscript executed by what appears to be a single illustrator working in one coherent style. The manuscript is not a compilation of different traditions. It is one document that synthesizes them as if its author lived at a crossroads where Christianity, Eastern religion, and something else entirely had merged into a single coherent worldview. And throughout, appearing again and again, is a sun symbol with exactly 17 rays. 17, a number with no documented significance in any known European, Middle Eastern, or Asian symbolic tradition. In 1866, Hungarian linguist Paul Hunfalvi declared the Rohank Codex a hoax, attributing it to Samuel Literati Nemes, a documented forger who was active in Hungary at the time of the donation and known to fabricate historical artifacts. That attribution has never been proven, and Literati Nemes's known forgeries all imitated existing styles. He added false provenances to recognizable artifacts. The Rohank Codex imitates nothing. It presents a completely original script, a completely original symbolic tradition, and an illustrative vocabulary that has no clear antecedent in any documented culture. That is a different kind of undertaking entirely. The mainstream position remains. It is an early 19th century hoax, probably by Literati Nemes, designed to be unreadable by virtue of an invented script. The absence of pre-1838 provenance supports recent fabrication. The mixed religious imagery is a forger's attempt to create an aura of ancient multicultural mystique. The statistical language-like properties are a sophisticated feature of the hoax. But the 2018 computational analysis found natural language structure in the text, something no known human forger has ever successfully produced at 448 pages of length. A text that passes mathematical linguistic analysis designed to distinguish language from noise is not producing that result by accident. Either the Rohank Codex is genuine or its creator possessed an understanding of statistical linguistics that did not exist until the 20th century. Why has no international multidisciplinary consortium ever been formally assembled to study it with the full battery of modern analytical tools, radiocarbon dating of the ink, hyperspectral imaging, full computational linguistic analysis? It is one of the longest undeciphered manuscripts in existence. The institutional passivity surrounding it is its own kind of mystery. And what does the 17-rayed sun mean? Someone thought that number mattered. Someone carved it or drew it over and over again across a document in a language no one can read. That number means something. We just don't know what. From an anonymous donation in Budapest, we arrive at our final text, one that describes, with the clinical calm of someone who has seen it happen before, the end of everything. The Kolbrin Bible. There is a passage in one of the Egyptian sections of the Kolbrin that describes a celestial object's approach in the following terms. It is visible in daylight before it strikes. It drags a tail of debris across the sky. It disturbs the oceans through gravitational influence before it arrives, and the darkness that follows lasts for many days. This description was written, or at least claimed to have been written, approximately 3,000 years ago. In 2007, a team of researchers led by Richard Firestone published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences proposing that a cosmic impact or airburst event occurred at the Younger Dryas boundary approximately 12,900 years ago, producing exactly the effects the Kolbrin describes. In 2018, a follow-up study published in the Journal of Geology confirmed evidence for this event at sites across multiple continents. The Kolbrin called the object the Destroyer. It described the event in detail. The geological record confirms the event happened. The timeline is the uncomfortable part. The Kolbrin Bible is a collection of texts presented as originating in two traditions: Egyptian scribal records reaching back to approximately 1600 to 1200 BCE, and Celtic records from approximately the 1st century CE. The physical manuscript tradition is associated with Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset, England, where the texts were reportedly kept before the Abbey fire of 1184 CE, after which a group called the Chaldeans allegedly preserved them through the medieval period. A modern publication was produced by Hope Publishing House in New Zealand in 1994. Its pre-modern physical provenance has not been independently verified by a peer-reviewed academic institution. That is the central evidentiary problem, and it cannot be ignored. But the content raises questions that the provenance dispute does not resolve. The destroyer is described not as a one-time divine punishment, but as a recurring object on a known orbital path. Something that has visited the inner solar system before and will do so again. The text gives observable characteristics consistent with a long-period comet or large body entering from the outer solar system. The red-tinged sky that precedes it, the smell it carries, its gravitational effect on oceans before direct impact. In 1999, astrophysicists John Murray and John Matisse independently published papers proposing the existence of a large undiscovered solar body based on anomalies in Oort cloud comet trajectories, the same orbital region from which the Kolbrin's destroyer would logically originate. In 2016, Caltech researchers Konstantin Badigan and Mike Brown formalized the Planet 9 hypothesis based on similar gravitational anomalies. The Kolbrin's description of a recurring large body on an elliptical orbit anticipated these scientific proposals by years, in some cases by decades. The global destroyer tradition is also not unique to the Kolbrin. Sumerian texts describe a celestial intruder called Nibiru. The Hindu Puranas describe a recurring object associated with global catastrophe. Mesoamerican traditions across multiple unconnected cultures describe cyclical, world-ending events associated with astronomical phenomena. These sources have verified ancient provenance. They are telling versions of the same story. The mainstream verdict on the Kolbrin is blunt: modern fabrication. A text with no verifiable pre-1994 physical history, whose descriptions of ancient catastrophes happen to match scientific hypotheses that were being developed contemporaneously. If the manuscript was assembled or fabricated in the 20th century, its younger Dryas details and orbital mechanics could simply reflect the available science of the period. That is the most parsimonious explanation, and intellectual honesty requires stating it clearly. But if the Kolbrin is a fabrication, its author anticipated the 2007 PNAS impact study, the 2018 Journal of Geology confirmation, and the Planet 9 hypothesis by years, and the global convergence of catastrophe traditions in ancient texts with verified provenance, all describing the same recurring object with the same characteristics, does not disappear when the Kolbrin's credibility is questioned. Those texts exist. They describe the same thing. Whatever the destroyer is or was, the memory of it appears to have outlasted the civilizations that witnessed it. What is the object? Is it still out there, on its return path? And if the most specific surviving ancient description of it is a book whose physical origin has never been verified, was that obscurity accidental, or was it engineered? Line up these 10 books. One was cut from the biblical canon by official decree that still survives in writing. One was buried in a clay jar in the Egyptian sand while the order to destroy it was still being carried out. One was carried as contraband across the Silk Road from Judea to China. One was locked in a royal archive after kings paid fortunes to possess it. One has never been decoded, not by medieval scholars, not by wartime cryptographers, not by artificial intelligence. And one describes, in clinical detail, an astronomical event that modern science is still trying to prove happened. The pattern connecting them is not coincidence, it is consistency. Across every continent, across 3,000 years of recorded history, the same categories of knowledge keep appearing and keep disappearing. The origin of humanity, the nature of consciousness, the history of catastrophe, the identity of whoever or whatever provided the foundational sciences of civilization. Each time this knowledge surfaces, something moves to contain it. An institution, a decree, a fire, a vault, a classification. The method varies, the outcome is the same. The mainstream position on all of this is coherent, and it deserves your genuine consideration. Institutions suppress what threatens them. That is simply the behavior of power, explainable without invoking conspiracy. Scholars and forgers fabricate what they wish existed. Human beings are extraordinarily skilled at finding patterns in noise, and the history of forbidden knowledge is littered with texts that turned out to be hoaxes, misreadings, or projections. That case is real. But here is the question it cannot fully close. Why does forbidden knowledge always carry the same shape? Why does it always concern the same subjects, the structure of the cosmos, the origin of human consciousness, the memory of catastrophe, the existence of beings more capable than us? Forgers copy what already exists. If all these texts were fabricated, what were they imitating? And if they were suppressed, what was the original knowledge they were preserving or threatening to reveal? The history of what was destroyed tells us more about what was real than the history of what was permitted to survive. You made it to the end of this list. That means you understand that. Most people accept the textbook explanation and move on. You stayed because you sense the gap between what we are taught and what the evidence actually shows. That instinct is worth trusting. This channel exists for people who refuse to accept that the most important questions have already been answered. Hit subscribe and join the archive. Then go to the comments and tell me this. Which of these 10 books, if it were fully decoded or verified tomorrow, would collapse everything we think we know? And why? Make your case. The floor is yours. Every civilization that ever existed left something behind. Most of what they left, we lost. To fire, to water, to the deliberate hands of people who had decided the rest of us weren't ready. But fragments survived. Encoded in 13 lines, buried in a clay jar, carried by monks across a desert, hidden in a script no one alive can read. These fragments made it through because someone understood that the most dangerous thing you can preserve is the truth about where we came from. The books on this list survived because someone refused to let them burn. The question now is whether you are willing to read them. Subscribe. The archive is open